Okay, so this next session, I want to share with you the key findings of a report that we launched the other day. We took the 500 largest companies in the world, the Fortune Global 500, and we looked at where are the women on the boards, where are the women in senior management. This is our 35th report in 29 years. We've been looking at women on the boards of different companies, of different regions, of different industries. And we do it because it creates a baseline data by which to measure whether we have achieved corporate leadership. I call it advocacy through data, which we need to do more. Numbers tell you what's there and what is lacking. And business and government function on the basis of data. It helps us, it helps the institutions we want to affect. So this one, we had been tracking the largest companies in the world since 2004, first looking at the 200 largest as ranked by Fortune on the basis of revenues, okay? This year, we decided to expand it to the 500 largest for the first time to get an even broader look, but we could still see the spectrum. So what did we find? Oh, I have the clicker. Does this thing work? There. So what we found is that globally, among the largest companies in the world, of which I think they're based in 34 countries, 28.9% of board seats are held by women. Now, in 2004, that was only 10.4%. So that represents an almost threefold progress, okay? That's a big deal. But look at this other not the other slide, the other pie chart. These are women in senior management. And look, it's only 21%, okay? This will show you a pattern that we found. There is no correlation between putting more women on boards, resulting in possibly more women in senior management. There is no such correlation. Two different things. And you say, well, why is that? Because it's easier to get talented women from the outside to sit on your board than it is to grow them from the bottom up and develop that expertise. That is an unfortunate fact. So how do we compare regionally? I can't read a blessed thing. And what you will see is that Europe, at 39%, has the best record of any region, and the lowest, as you will see, lies in the Asia-Pacific region. The U.S. and Canada, North America, doing a little bit better at around 34%. Catching up, if you will, because the U.S. was kind of behind Europe for a while, but now it's doing better. So when you get that average, 29.8%, it's because you're dealing with the highest at 39% and the lowest at around 10%. So you say, well, why is there such a discrepancy? Let me tell you, when we started in 2004, the largest companies were based in Europe and the United States. In 2004, they dominated the largest. In 2025, the largest companies, 40% of them were in Asia Pacific, which means that the center of gravity for the global market has shifted eastward, where we still have to develop women's talents in corporate leadership. So what that means is that the Asia Pacific market, as I mentioned yesterday, is one that we should look into in terms of participating, cross-border. It also means that our work in terms of global equality for women in the corporate arena means we need to develop strategies for the Asia-Pacific region. Now, you would think with Europe leading that the number one country, we compared regions, now we're comparing countries. And guess who came out number one at 50%? Australia. Yeah, she's grinning there because, it's my country. But as you will see, France leads all of Europe. And then European companies come and look at the bottom where China and Chinese Taipei are. They are developing economies, although some people will say China has developed. But they're developing in terms of that consciousness for raising more women's leadership in those regions. The U.S., doing better, but clearly nowhere near the top. So those are individual countries. If you want to take a photo, this is your country. This is the slide. Okay. So then, how do individual companies fare? These are the top 10 companies in terms of best performance in the appointments of women to corporate boards. Now, before you look at which companies, oh my God, look at the right. The last column are the percentages of women in these companies. And you see the bottom one, it says 53 point something percent. That's what it takes to get to the top 10. Can you imagine? All of the companies in the top 10 have female-dominated boards. We never saw that in 2004. Our top 10, you had to be 23 point something percent. Now look where we are, 53.9 just to reach the top 10 list. All right? That is significant progress. Now, number one goes to an Australian company, of course, Woolworths, okay, which is based in Australia. And then you will see Australia has another company there in the top 10, National Australia Bank, and we will have Ann Sherry, who's on that board, speak to you later. You will also see BNP Paribas over there, right? I think at around number 4. And we will have Guylaine Diefre, who is the corporate secretary and who serves on other corporate boards, speak to you later. And the only German company that made it to the top 10 is Bayer. So we have Earther & Cousin who will speak to you later. So you see that? Australia, USA, and France. Isn't that amazing? I'm so proud of these women. So that's your top 10. Now, on corporate boards. Why is it that some companies, regions, and countries do better than others? You have heard mention already of the German quota. Well, the quota actually became a popular strategy when Norway in 2003 imposed a quota of 40% of board seats had to be held by women by a certain date, and if a company didn't meet that quota by that date, their whole board will be abolished. They'd have to start from zero. In Italy, which also not only met but surpassed their quota, it was because you were fined as a company if you did not meet the target on the date that was mentioned in the law. So the quotas that work the best are those that have sanctions and deadlines, sanctions for non-compliance. But other countries, we call them soft quotas, don't have that, and they don't work as well. But now you have about 44 countries that have quotas. But look, Japan was the last one, 2022. UAE has it. Bahrain has it. Malaysia has a quota. Okay, Panama has a quota. It started in Europe and has spilled over to other countries. So now there is this global strategy that is being used. The EU created a mandate for all 28 member nations that they had to reach a percentage. So when you add the 28 to the 44, you're like in around 70-some countries that now have quotas for women on boards. It works. Quotas work. Companies do not want to break a law. So when it's the law of the land, there's something to be said for these legal mandates because it forces demand on the part of companies. The supply was always there. All of you in this room, those outside of you, outside this room, we have talented women who were board ready. What quotas do is force demand. And so I don't want somebody sneering down, looking at it and saying, oh my God, I don't want to be a quota woman. Oh, get over it. It's a door, and we have to push it open. Use it. You know, why would you not? And what the heck is a quota woman anyway? You have a vote on the board. You can articulate. You are smart. And do you think a company could afford to put a bobo on a board, whether male or female? That annual report is going to have that person listed? Oy, no. So, quotas work, but not every country has a quota that's effective. In Australia, they had a stock exchange strategy in which they put in the corporate governance code that you had to show diversity, the diverse composition of your company. They set targets, they competed with each other. They had something called Male Champions of Change, which were CEOs who volunteered to be sponsors of one or two women using their own networks to put women on boards. I gave an award to the stock exchange in Sydney because that was an effort that really succeeded. And it came from the private sector. It was not mandated by the government, but it works. And that's what we need, a real strategy. In the US, we don't do mandates. Stock exchange, well, no, actually NASDAQ did put, it's not a mandate. They wanted information you had to file, right? And say, what is your board composition and your plans for making it diverse? And so in this new era, they were sued by conservative lawyers for being discriminatory to have that in place, and they took it back, unfortunately. But there are other strategies. What work in the U.S. is what I call shareholder pressure. Pension funds, okay, investment funds said, we want to see a woman on the board. When Facebook did an IPO, a question in Wall Street Journal from one of the columnists said, if women are the majority of social media users, why is there not a single woman on your board? And it went viral. Then other writers started writing about it and said, yeah, why is that? That's how Sheryl Sandberg got on the board, but it was an internal person as opposed to an external, independent director. But they have progressed since then. So it's shareholder. The pension funds in the U.S. are huge, okay? These are the pension funds of all kinds of government employees. CalSTRS, teachers, they own millions of some companies' shares. When they say, we will not vote if your board is not diverse, that is shareholder pressure. New York Pension Fund has that, California Pension Fund, Rhode Island Pension Fund, those are huge. And so that has an impact. I'm sharing this with you because there are other strategies that you can employ in your respective countries. If they don't want to do a quota, there are other strategies. The most basic one, put board diversity and specifically gender diversity on boards in your corporate governance code. And you say, what is that? Those are good governance practices, and sometimes they're in stock exchanges, and sometimes they're separate commissions, okay? And better yet, get on those boards. Okay, so moving on, there is a quota for women in senior management that I mentioned previously. The first one to do that, and why do you think that is needed? Because you have to create a pipeline of women to become board directors and CEOs. And so Germany was the first country in the world to have a quota for women in senior management. If there are 3 senior management, 1 must be at least a woman. No, we should, because that was the first one ever, okay? Then France immediately followed. Oh, we're not going to be superseded by Germany. Well, you know, let me tell you, competition works. So what? So they did it too, but larger numbers of companies, same rule, but it's either gender. No one gender should dominate, okay? And then in Iceland, they have what's called an executive order. It was the prime minister set a target, and he said, by this date, hopefully, we will have. And if you look at the bottom numbers, these strategies, the 2 quotas have worked, the numbers have increased, and they're going nearer the target. So what's important here? You have to have a strategy, okay? And there's something to be said for legal mandates. Now, what are the companies that are doing best in appointing women to senior management? There are 29 companies in the top 10 because of ties. And if Europe dominated the list of best performing in terms of board directors, U.S. companies, you will see that a lot. Here's the second part. U.S. companies tend to develop women senior managers more. So you will see a lot of U.S. companies here. What you will also see is that the majority of companies, and I'm going to go back, have reached parity in senior management. That is rare. You see, over 50% is parity. Okay, this is the first list. That's quite an achievement in senior management. The next list, same thing. Only a few are at 40% near the bottom, right? 40-something percent. That is rare. We did not see that kind of progress before, okay? It takes time, but, you know, when you develop a strategy, it works. Next. Women board chairs and women executives, the highest ranks in executive talent, not there. In the Fortune Global 500, the 500 largest companies in the world, 39 were headed by women. It's what, 6-something%? Board chairs, not many either. So you get on the board, but you're not leading committees. That is a big deal. Chairing a committee. CEOs, clearly the glass ceiling remains. We aren't there. But I want to share with you something really interesting. Those 39 companies headed by women in the 500 largest list had a higher percentage of women on boards and women in senior management than male-led companies. Do you see this? And we had prior studies just looking at where women directors are and senior managers in women-led companies. We've done it twice, and that's the result we found. When women run companies, there's a higher percentage of women on boards, higher percentage than women in management. They're not feminists. They are business people who want their companies to succeed. But maybe because of their own experiences, they're more blind to gender when it comes to talent. So that is a terrific number. So in Germany, which are the ones? These are the top 5 that you will see. Bayer, of course, number 1 there in terms of boards and in terms of Women in Senior Management Alliance. So these are the 5. In general, the companies in the Fortune 500 that are German averaged around 34%. That's a lot higher than many years past. So what do we have to do? You have to be intentional about creating change. The numbers tick up when there is a strategy, as I mentioned before. It doesn't happen naturally. You know how people say that? Oh, there's so many talented women, they'll rise naturally to the top. It didn't happen. So we have to have actual initiatives. I can't read, that's the second one. Hello? A little help here? Business case. Yes. I said that last night. We have to say it over and over to executives, okay? It is not social justice. The inclusion of women in senior management is good business practice. We have a bibliography of 102 reports that say the same thing. But McKinsey years ago did a study. They interviewed over 2,000 executives. 60% understand the business case, but only 29% acted on it. So, third, you got the message. You have to develop talent. In Australia, there was a company on their 200-year anniversary. They announced that they reached parity in management. It took them 10 years through 2 CEOs to follow through a plan. You know, it required training, it required incentives, it required incentives like pay. It required accounting from every manager as to where they were in that journey, and they did it. So on their 200-year anniversary, and I was there, the CEO at that time announced and said, we are at parity. I mention this because it takes time, but you have to plan for it and do it, okay? The fourth, workplace culture. Oh, our prior CEOs already hinted at that. I mentioned yesterday that we lose in the United States a lot of women engineers. We graduate them, they go to work, and after 2 years, they leave. And in the study that was reported in the New York Times, it was because of a toxic work environment in which they felt they were not supported, not only by supervisors, but by their colleagues, whom they felt worked hard to make sure they are ejected. It is horrible, but it's the microaggressions mentioned earlier, and not being given opportunities to lead projects or be part of projects that are large. And lastly, it matters who leads a company, who leads any institution. Leadership matters. The CEO who actually, as Michael said, walks the talk, makes a big difference. So that's our prescriptions for change, and that's the report. Now, I would like to hear from, let's hear first from Eartharin and her reaction to the report. Eartharin Cousin was the former head of the UN World Food Program, and prior to that, she was U.S. Ambassador to the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. So please welcome Eartharin Cousin.
Good morning. Oh, that's too weak. Good morning. There we go. I know you've been sitting for a long time, but this is a women's conference. That's about power. So, thank you. Thank you, Irene. Thank you to all of you for the opportunity to reflect on the findings of this year's Fortune Global 500 report. The report is more than a ranking. It is a mirror and a mandate. A mirror revealing who holds power in the world's most influential companies, and a mandate demanding that we change what we see in that reflection. Yes, there has been progress. Companies are showing resilience, driving innovation, and powering economies forward. But the truth remains stark. Women, especially women of color, are still missing from the rooms where decisions are made in too many places around the world. The boardrooms, the C-suites, the corner offices, even in the Global 500, the numbers remain painfully low. As a member of the supervisory board of the Bayer AG, one of the world's most influential life sciences companies, I've had the privilege to help guide the governance at the highest level. I've been seen firsthand. Diverse leadership is not a nice to have. It is a business imperative. It is a difference between companies that survive the storms, because the storms will come, and those companies that shape our future. Europe has often set the pace when it comes to governance, and the EU's Women on Boards Directive is one more sign of what we've always known. Companies perform better when their leadership looks like the world they serve. That's not theory, it's data, it's evidence. Diverse boards make better decisions. Clearly navigating complexity more effectively, and diverse boards lead with the kind of empathy that today's global economy demands. Diverse leadership is not just about better performance, though better performance is a bottom line that every company must achieve, but we must go on, because diverse representation is also about power, legitimacy, accountability. And diverse representation is not a favor. It is the right thing to do. Our stakeholders, investors, employees, consumers are demanding more than just empty commitments. They want authenticity, inclusion. They want to see you. They want to see us, not just in glossy reports, but in boardrooms, at the head of the table, shaping the future. And let's be clear, this is not just about checking a box. This is about unlocking the full potential of our companies and our economies. When women lead, we don't just bring new perspectives, we expand the playing field. We shift priorities. We lead with both rigor and compassion. And we open doors not just for ourselves, but for every woman coming behind us. And we saw that with the number of women-led companies that, in comparison to the number of women in executive leadership. At Bayer, we embrace this idea, not because we're told to or because we're mandated, but because we see the values that I've just articulated. Our commitment to gender equity is woven in how we govern on the supervisory board, because it's about how we grow and ultimately how we grow that leadership inside the organization. But my sisters in this room and our allied brothers, we are not finished. We cannot be satisfied with incremental change. It's been 29 years since you started doing these reports. We must drive this change across the entire globe. We must also acknowledge a shifting axis of global economic power, as you saw in the data. Asian enterprises now account for nearly half of the Fortune Global 500. A remarkable ascent, signaling the region's expanding influence on everything from supply chains to innovation to capital markets. And yet, even as these companies rise, women remain noticeably absent from the boardrooms and executive leadership of many of Asia's corporate giants. This imbalance must not be accepted as a cultural norm or an inevitable lag. It is a missed opportunity, both moral and economic. A global economy cannot thrive when half the population is underleveraged. Companies competing on the global stage must reflect the diversity of our world, not just in markets, but in their leadership. Inclusion must accompany growth, or progress will remain incomplete. So here's the charge. Let us transform representation into power. Let us build diverse cultures, starting at the board level, but throughout the enterprise, from the C-suite to frontline managers. Diverse cultures that don't just include women, but trust women, follow women, and elevate women. Let us move from visibility to voice, from voice to influence, and from influence to transformative power. When we as women take our seats at that governance table, we are not just stewarding capital, we are rewriting the rules. We are making it impossible for anyone to say there is not a qualified woman, because we're setting the standard for what true leadership looks like. So let's use this year's Global 500 report not just as a scorecard, but as a rallying cry. A reminder that we are not done, a call to every company that claims to lead. Look around your boardroom. If you do not see women, you are not leading. You are lagging. Because when women lead fully, unapologetically, and without ceilings, companies compete harder, adapt faster, and deliver more equitably. And we make clear to the world, leadership does not come in one color, one sex, one culture. It comes in excellence. And excellence looks like all of you. Indeed. Stand up. You've been sitting all morning. Stand up. Everybody stand up. 1 minute. And I'm wrapping this up. All right. Say to your neighbor, this is what power looks like. This is what leadership looks like. Woo! Because now is the time, and the time is now. Thank you.
Hello? Shh. We call that doing church. The Church of Women. So we continue. Shh. We'll be finished soon. The next speaker is a longtime friend of the summit, longtime friend of mine. Her first summit was 1998 in London, and over the years been coming back. She's a veteran. And when she first came, she was the CEO of the Bank of Melbourne. Then she became CEO of the Bank of New Zealand. Then she became CEO of Carnival Australia. And now she decided to be the Chancellor of Queensland University. She heads up UNICEF Australia. So I said, aren't you tired? What other thing do you want to lead? Please give a hand to Anne Sherry.
Thank you, Irene. This is a tough act to follow, right? So if I could sing, I would, but I can't. So I am a director of the National Australia Bank, which on the previous lists ranks in the top 10 both for the number of female directors and also for the number of female executives. In fact, it's the only company on that list that ranks in the top 10 for both. And so, but it has taken time. And so I just want to say to you that change needs to be intentional or it is too slow. If it's not intentional, if it's not planned for, if it's not part of the DNA of your organisation, if diversity and recognition of the skills that come to boards and executives from diversity is not recognised, it takes forever to get that sort of change. So intentionality is a strategy. It's not something you do just because it's, today we feel like doing it. Hence my earlier question to the CEOs who are here. The second thing I'd say to you is it's an active strategy, not a passive one. Sometimes setting targets is a passive strategy. You set the targets, you come back a year or two later and you go, wow, nothing much has changed. So this does need to be an active strategy, not a passive one, to get into that top 10 list. And the third thing I'd say is that, quite frankly, it needs leadership. It needs leadership at the board level, but it equally needs leadership at the executive level of the organisation. And then the final reason for getting this done faster and sharper across all of our economies is that all of our businesses need the capacity to innovate, to manage risk better, and adapt in a rapidly changing world. And we will never get there if our boards and executive teams look like the boards and executive teams of the 1950s, because that's where your company mindset will end up. If that's what it looks like. It needs to change. So, what happened in Australia to make this happen? And to end up with two of those companies there. Woolworths, by the way, has a female CEO as well as a female-dominated board, and it's a very large food retailer. In fact, it's the largest in Australia. What happened, as Irene's already mentioned, is firstly, corporate governance guidelines came from the Australian Stock Exchange more than a decade ago. The Australian Stock Exchange said to all companies listed in Australia, if you want to be a listed company, you need to report on the composition of your board every year to the Stock Exchange, and we will publish it. And we will name and shame all the companies that don't move. And every year, even now, there are a handful of companies, some of them small, some of them in sectors where sometimes there's a strong founder. Those companies every year are named and shamed who have no women on the board. There's only a handful of them left. But also the companies that don't move forward are also named, and you can see performance over time. That has been a very powerful public mechanism because all of those companies have shareholders. All of those companies have investors, and all of those shareholders, which many of you may be in your countries, have the capacity to turn up at an AGM and ask the question directly of their board about why they haven't changed the composition, the gender composition of their board. That was the first thing. The second thing that changed is investor voices have changed over time. Irene gave the examples of the pension funds in the US. In Australia, our private capital market, the capital held in superannuation pension funds in Australia, is now as big as our public capital market. $4 trillion are held in superannuation funds in Australia. Those shareholders, the people in those funds, are Australian workers, by and large. And those funds are active investors. And the CEOs of those funds, when it comes to reporting season for companies in Australia, ask questions publicly and through media about the composition of boards, whether those boards that don't have enough diversity are fit for purpose in the 21st century, whether those boards have the capability to meet the demands of that business, whether those boards can risk management when their directors look like the directors of a past era. That has been a very, very powerful change mechanism in our market. The third thing that's changed, and this goes to the executive ranks, is that all of the executives in all of the companies actually that I'm on, where I'm on the board, have targets that are set for diversity in their businesses, and those targets have financial incentives. And so you feel the pain if you don't achieve your targets. And they're not small amounts in their incentives, they're larger amounts in their incentives. And there's nothing quite like a motivation of a target with money attached. Because also if you don't attach positive and negative incentives, then it's just another set of words. It's another thing in the list of incentives in the organisation. The fourth thing is that for all of us as directors, as company directors, and all of you in the room, we are actually charged with making sure our companies deliver good returns, better returns, are charged with being ready for the changing world, as we saw earlier with demographics and AI, are charged with making sure our companies can deliver the performance that we promise the market. And we know that that happens when you have diverse teams. If your executive team, again, looks like an executive team of a bygone era, your chances of delivering or outperforming are very low. And so as company directors, we have a collective responsibility, whether you're a male or female director, to make sure that happens. And then finally, in our world, government comes down the list a bit further. And so government in Australia has not driven the change in the private sector. The stock exchange led and drove a lot of that. But government does drive change in its own boards, and all governments, state and federal governments in Australia, now require the boards that they appoint to be gender balanced. And most recently, that has extended into the boards of sporting organisations. So pay attention, everyone, to this one. Where do you think power sits now in many of our countries? It sits on the board of sporting organisations. Where does influence sit? Who wants to go to major sporting events all over the world? Oh, that would be leaders of nations. Men everywhere want to go to sporting events. So if your sports boards don't reflect change, then how on earth can we get change in that area of our community? And in most of our countries, government stumps up plenty of money into sport. And so in Australia, the government has just announced that as it puts funding into sporting organisations right across the country, even those that are quite well supported by sponsors and others, that every sporting organisation in Australia needs to have gender balance on its board. Everyone. And as we're going to be the host of the 2032 Olympics, that's actually going to be true of all the Olympic organising events as well. Everything that touches sport in Australia, by the time the Olympics arrive in 2032, will be gender balanced. Irene also mentioned Champions of Change, which began as male Champions of Change, in fact, because all the CEOs were men. It's now being called the Champions of Change Coalition, because that first generation of men who were members of that group committed publicly to reporting every year on the change that was being made through their organisations. And many of them were not listed companies, so they weren't required through the listing rules to do it at the stock exchange. But the next generation of CEOs, in a very substantial proportion of those companies, are women. And so that organisation has continued, but it is now a coalition of male and female champions of change who inside their organisations chase down the cultural pockets where things aren't really moving, chase down the parts of their organisation where women aren't flourishing, chase down the recruitment of graduates and their support into universities to make sure that they've got women coming into their organisations at equal numbers of men and women. So that part of our change process actually is driven by the CEOs of those companies and is also publicly reported on. Shining a light on the things that work and don't work, the organisations that have driven change and haven't driven change, is a really powerful mechanism. People, companies, CEOs, boards do not like being in the public for the things that they don't want to be recognised for. That is, failure to address change in their organisations. And that tool is probably available to all of us in our own markets to highlight the companies that do well, but also to name the companies who do not do well. And now in our market in Australia, our next frontier is to make sure not only have we got gender equality, but we also have the cultural diversity on our boards that reflects the multicultural nature of our community. And that's the next phase of change. Thank you.
If you noticed in the top 10 list, BNP Paribas was there. And so we are grateful to have its corporate secretary, who serves on other corporate boards, with us today. Please welcome Guylaine Diev.
So I guess you wonder why BNP Paribas is part of those top 10 companies. I would say that BNP Paribas is definitely pro-women and has been proving it for a long time. And we are now well above the requirements of the French requirements. We have, I was very happy to see the figures, 57% of women in the board. Actually, we have increased a little bit the number of members of the board, so now we're perfect parity with 8 men and 8 women. And we have to pay attention because we were almost tangenting the 60%, but there is a French law which says no more than 60% of each gender. So actually we have almost the reverse problem. We have 42% of women in the executive committee, and we have 37% of women among the G100 top executives of the group. It is thanks to Jean-Laurent Bonnafé, who is the CEO of the bank, and really who promotes a tone at the top. Just to give you examples, we have, at the very early stage of the career of people joining the bank, 52% of female talents. We assume that actually we have to have a little bit over 50% because we know that at some time when, between 35 and 45, women can a little bit take a step back from their career. So we know that we have more losses at some point of having 52% of early talents means it leads to more equality. We impose to have at least one woman in each succession plan for senior manager and senior position, which means to think out of the box because, at first, men said, we do not see any women. And we say, okay, we didn't explain very well. You have to find one. And finally, at the end of the day, now we have women in every succession plan. We also have specific plans in, very specific businesses and functions. Let's take an example. In IT, we have a plans of recruiting 1,000 women within IT, within BNP Paribas. And this is a challenge because we don't have that many people who want to join, and we also promote them internally by offering training for those women to join IT. We also have an initiative which is called Jamais sans elles, which means never without ladies. The G100 top executives of the bank have signed a chart, and they refuse to participate to any panel if there is not at least one woman in the panel. And a number of my male colleagues have refused to participate, especially, as we said, in countries in which it's not that cultural to have very many senior executive females. So actually, this is the reason, why BNP Paribas entered this top 10 companies with women. But what is interesting beside the figures is how can we promote the gender diversity and lead to parity? And what are the levers? I see 3 main levers. It's essential to act at all phases of the professional career, from the initial training to throughout the career. And the board of directors have a key role to promote the female talents, to fully integrate them into the strategy and the governance of the company. So the 3 levers to open up female access to highest responsibilities means that it is not a lack of skills nor a lack of ambition. It's just the mechanism of ascension that remain inadequate. Companies have to encourage young girls to explore scientific and technical fields and to enroll them in operational roles, mostly with profit and losses. Why? Because actually you're never going to appoint, or almost never going to appoint, the head of HR, the head of marketing, the head of communication, the head of ESG, who are more or less traditionally more devoted to females. You are going to find people who have been in business roles with a business unit, with a profit and loss, who suffered crises, and or very technical roles such as financial CFOs. And we need to have more engineer and very high technical trainings. So this means that as far as, the education, at a very, very early stage of education, you have to promote those scientific and technical trainings. Then, as I mentioned earlier, you have to integrate a women in succession plan, and this requires active monitoring of career path with equitable opportunities for progression. The companies need to build and to support female pools of talent, which means to support actively, to promote the personal development with training and mentoring. And the promoting gender diversity is also the duty of care of directors, because the directors must ensure that senior management take concrete actions by questioning, challenging, supporting the implementation of gender commitment, and ensure that it is translated in tangible results. The companies need to set clear, measurable goals, track progress by adjusting their strategies, and have KPIs to transform the mindset through both the awareness and training. And these levers for performance are not only for the major companies. It also is for SMEs and mid-caps, who must also be fully involved to guarantee a sustainable evolution. To conclude, I would say that promoting gender diversity is totally a part of future-proof companies.
Only one question. Okay, go to the mic. Isn't there a mic in there?
There's a mic here.
Yes. Oh.
Hi.
Go ahead.
My name is Emmeline Ramasan. I'm 21. I'm a student in machine learning, and I coded an AI companion for women with menopause at one of the largest AI research institutes in the world, Mila, in Canada. I would like to know, what are some strategies to encourage more men of my generation to engage in this conversation and comprehend that inclusivity and quotas are opportunities that aren't attacking their careers?
Good question. Yeah. Anybody? Anne?
So the reality is that sharing a future for men and women is very different, say, for men of my generation who really thought they did have it all to themselves. So let's be clear about that. A gender-diverse world is a world where people share and where incompetent men don't get to the level they once did. Except maybe through politics. Apologies to all the politicians here. I think the conversation is my observation. So I'm the Chancellor of a university, so it's a conversation I have a lot. My observation is that young men do want a life and opportunities and options that do better align with what women want. So they do want to have time with their children if they're going to have children. They do want to have time out of work, not just to work until they're nearly dead and then die. They do want a life where there is better balance. And so I think that conversation is happening, certainly inside the worlds that I see. I think the challenge is when you get into a workplace and your mentor group or the men around you say different things or expect different things of you. And I think that's probably the frontier that all our organisations need to push into. But in my organisation, in the bank, and actually I chair an airport as well, that in the airport, which has got a lot more male workers than employees than female, we have conversations. So we have this sort of idea that people can come together and talk about issues that they're dealing with in their workplaces. And young men do raise the concerns they have that the expectations on them are different to their expectations of what they want to do with their lives. So I think inside organisations these issues can be dealt with. But we've got to shine a light on it, talk about it, actually allow young men and women to be able to raise those sorts of issues themselves.
Did you want to respond, Ghislaine, or?
Yeah, I just would like to add that for me there are three things that are essential. Education, education, education. Because actually, as early as you take it, I mean, you have also to promote with the little girls the idea that you don't have jobs for men and jobs for women, and that this parity must exist at a very early stage.
Very quickly, because I agree with what both of the previous speakers have said, when we often hear the pushback that you talk about with women coming into power, it is because of a concern regarding scarcity, that there's not enough, and that if you get something, I lose something, rather than seeing the opportunity for growing the pie because of the intellect that you bring, because of the decisions that are made that grow the economics of whether it's a country or a nation, that provide more opportunities, ensuring the ability for more places, for more people of diversity.
Thank you.